Okay, today's stuff we're going to be learning is Moed Katan Daf Cafe, reminding everyone to register for the Siyum that's happening on Thursday at 7 p.m. Israel time. Note the difference in time from usual. We're excited to have Rabbanit Michelle Farber speaking and one of our learners, Sarah Berelowitz. So please come and specifically Rabbanit Michelle is going to be speaking about an interesting story. Talking of interesting stories, we're going to have a bunch of them today as well. Okay, with that, we will get started. So we start off kind of halachic with our Mishnah. I'll go back to the Mishnah that we learned already in yesterday's daf at the bottom of Kaf Daled Amud Bet. Ein kol'in velo chotzin ve'ein mavlin ela chovav shomet ve'ein mavlin ela amitaz kufa. I didn't mention this in the last class, but I'll mention it now that there's a big debate about this Mishnah. The Mishnah basically says you can't tear kriya, you can't take the shirt off your shoulder, which we learned about was one of the customs they would do. You can't do the su'udat havra'ah, which is the meal that the avelim eat when they get back from the cemetery. And there were sometimes where they would do it actually in the middle of the street or in the house. Nowadays, they do it in the house of the mourners. Ela krovav shalmet. The only people who can eat at this meal, who can tear kriya, who can do that, are the relatives of the dead person. By the way, we don't do this anymore. The family members do eat with the avelim, or at least I know sometimes, some people have that custom. Ve'em mavlin ela mitaz kufa. The mitah we're talking about is it's almost like a bench. That's where you sit. It's where you ate. It's where you did everything. You slept. That was your bed. And we learned already you're supposed to turn the bed over, but for that meal, you leave it upright. That's one interpretation. Another, and then again, you're learning two things. Only the avel, the ones who are really technically mourners, can do this, not anyone else. And you keep the bed upright for that meal. It's a little bit strange. Why would you do that? It's not so clear. Some people say that we're referring to Chol Moed here, and that all these are referring to Chol Moed. If it's a regular day, if somebody wants to mourn, they can mourn. Even if they're not, they can tear kriya. If it's Chol Moed, then only the mourners can do it. And then we're limiting. And that's why we keep the bed upright and we don't turn it upside down, because it's Chol Moed. And then this Mishnah connects back to, right, if you forgot, but we've been dealing in this Masechet all about Chol Moed, and we go back to that issue. So there's a debate about it. Now, it is strange. If it really was Chol Moed, it should have said Chol Moed. Okay, we're going to kind of go with the fact that it's probably talking about a regular day. And then we'll see, in other words, all the questions the Gemara is going to ask, you could really explain either which way, but then you'd have to say that all these other sources we're quoting also have to do with Chol Moed as well, okay, if you're going on the Chol Moed Parshanut commentary. The Gemara is going to now ask three questions and say, but wait, you're saying that you can only tear kriya and do this, the meal and the chalitza, taking off the shirt, only for those three people, but only for your relatives. But we're going to see three other situations where you do tear kriya, even though you're not the relative. So the question is going to be, right, how does that make any sense? So the Gemara is going to start off with this. We're going to say here now, Va'afilu chacham. Okay, what about a chacham? When a chacham dies, okay, this is what we know, a Talmid chacham dies, you can't tear kriya, you can't do that. Let's see. It says, V'hatanya in a braita, chacham shemet hakol chovav. Everybody is his relative. Now the Gemara says, wait a minute, stop the braita for a second. We have to clarify something. Hakol krovav sakadata. What do you mean? Everyone's his relative. That makes absolutely no sense. How could everyone be his relative? Ela hakol kikrovav. Everybody is like his relative. Okay. So chacham mates, you're all treated like a relative, which means, now the braita continues. That was kind of a parentheses, break of the braita to try to explain it. Okay, we figured that out. Doesn't mean everybody becomes their relative. It means everybody is like their relatives. By the way, because we're bringing up this chacham issue, even though we're going to leave it in a minute, we're going to come back to it. And the rest of our daf is going to be stories about rabbis who died and reactions and situations and things that happened and natural phenomenon that went on or that were a little bit unnatural and all sorts of interesting things. But so now we have to resolve this issue. So they say, so again, akol korin alav, akol chotzin alav, right? All the things mentioned in the Mishnah, and akol mavrin alav b'rechavan. Everybody partakes in the sudat havra'ah that's out in the street. So lo tzricha delav chachamu. Okay, well, we just basically have to limit our Mishnah and say, okay, our Mishnah wasn't talking about when a chacham dies. Our Mishnah was talking about a regular person dying. Okay, and that resolves our issue. And with that, we say, okay, so we're going to basically, every time we're going to have a question, we're going to basically say we're going to have three questions, limiting our Mishnah. Okay, so our Mishnah is not talking about anybody, right? It's not talking about a Talmid Chacham. If Talmid Chacham dies, you're allowed to mourn. not just the Talmidei Chacham's relatives. Next one, V'i Adam Kasherhu. If it was an upright citizen, as we would say, it was an upright citizen. If you hear about an upright citizen who died, you're also supposed to tear kriya. So again, how do we know this? Titania, each time we're going to bring a source that proves that we can do this. Mipnei ma banav ubnotav. This is always a difficult thing to read, okay, where the Gemara kind of tries to give reasons for why someone's children die young. Okay, it's always a big question. How could it be that someone's children die young, right? The children certainly aren't worthy of punishment for any reason. Mipnei ma banav ubnotav shel adam meitim kashem ketanim, right? On what situation would young children die? What's the reason? Kidei, again, we don't take these literally as we know this is the reason why, right? This is the rabbis trying to come up with things that they don't understand, right? Just like they say, al shalosh verot nashim metot b'shat leidatan, right? Women die in childbirth. These are ways that the rabbis grappled with it. It just shows that they're grappling with the same questions we ask. It's just sometimes their types of answers aren't necessarily the types of answers that we would use. So it's more like a stylistic thing. So what's the reason? In order that they cry and mourn over an Adam Kasher. The way we would say this, and in a minute we're going to reject it, this isn't really what it means, but right now they think the way you would say it is, in order so that he has sympathy for other people when they die, right? If you go through something tragic, so that will give you the sympathy to deal with other things, which doesn't seem very fair, to which the Gemara kind of says that. Yivkevi yitabel. What do you mean? So that in the future, he'll cry and mourn over someone? What is this, like a collateral that God gave him something on collateral and is taking it away from him? It doesn't make any sense that God would do that. Ella, it can't be that he's kind of being punished almost for something that hasn't even happened yet, right? So they say, it must be because someone had died and they didn't cry and didn't mourn over that person who was an upright citizen who died. And here we get to our halacha, which is anyone who cries and mourns for a righteous person or a good person, because of the kavod that he gave to that person, so all his sins or her sins become wiped out. So here you see that it's a value, and that's why the person must have not done that, and that's why their sins must have caught. Again, it's not saying because they didn't do this, they died, but they didn't have the protection from their sins to have protected them, and therefore their children died young. So now, again, I'm putting that issue aside of the reason why children die young, right? It certainly doesn't really answer the question, it satisfy everybody's, like, how could this possibly be? But it's the rabbi's attempt to give some sort of reason. The main point coming out from here for us is that that basically people should mourn and tear kriya for some good person who dies. So if that's the case, then again, our Mishnah doesn't make any sense. To which they say, now we're going to limit our Mishnah. Forget it wasn't talking about a Talmidei Chacham. It wasn't talking about an Adam Kasher. Now, who comes into the category of Adam Kasher is a good question, but that would probably really limit this a lot, our Mishnah. Next one. If you were there when you saw the person die, okay, if you're in the room when somebody's neshama leaves their body, well, you have to tear kriya. How do we know this? Titania, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, ha'omer al hameh b'shat yitziat neshama chayav likra. Someone who stands over the dead when, right, at the moment they die, also has to tear kriya. Lemazed domer, to what is this like? L'sefer Torah shenischat. It's like watching a Torah that's burning, right? You kind of watch the life go out of it. So therefore, you see, and then it says shachayav likra, just like you have to tear kriya if you see a sefer Torah that was burned. Likewise, you have to tear kriya when you see a person who dies. So how can you say only the krovav? You'd have to say again, we're limiting the Mishnah. So again, the Mishnah is not talking about Chacham who died. It's not talking about an Adam Kasher who died, and it's not talking about someone who was there at the time that the person died. All those people have to tear kriya, even if they're not relatives. Now we're going to start, because we talked about this Chacham, we're going to start with a slew of situations where rabbis died and all sorts of different things we're going to see about them. So we'll start with Rav Safra. Kinach nafshei de Rav Safra, lo karu Rabbanan alei. The rabbis didn't tear kriya when he died. So now they say, Ambre, lo gamrina mina. Mine. They said he wasn't our teacher, so we don't have to tear kriya if he's not our teacher. So we're going to see Abaye takes issue with them, and we're going to see there's three things that happen, okay? The first reaction is they say, oh, we're not tearing kriya. He wasn't our rabbi. To which Abaye says, Amar lu Abaye, mi tanya harav shemet. It doesn't say in the Braita, again, going back to the very beginning of the daf, it said, Chacham shemet hakol kikrovav. So it doesn't say harav, your rabbi, right? So what if he wasn't your rabbi? It says Chacham shemet Tanya, and he was a Chacham. So he might not have taught you, but he was clearly a Talmid Chacham. So you should tear kriya. Ve'od, and additionally, he said, by the way, you do learn from him. Why? Kol yom hashmatete b'fumim b'bei midrasha. He might not stand up and be your teacher, but you're constantly quoting things he said in the Beit Midrash. So he clearly is your teacher, right? Teacher doesn't necessarily mean the person who actually teaches you. It's whoever you're learning from and you're learning about and you're quoting his Torah. So of course you should. Okay, so he says you should have teared kriya. So now the rabbis say, Savor Maida Hava. Well, they said, okay, I guess we missed our chance because tear kriya right in the beginning. Remember, we learned B'Shaf Chimum, which again is a very unclear term what exactly Shaf Chimum is, and we even saw that there were different interpretations. But they figured, okay, we missed our chance. So, okay, you were right, Abaye, but too late. Amaluhu Abaye, he said, what are you talking about? Okay, second reaction of Abaye. Tanena, it says in the Braita, Chacham calls machoskim behesped chayavim likra. They're still dealing with his eulogies. And as long as they're dealing with his eulogies, you have to tear kriya. So now, what does it mean they were dealing with his eulogies? Two possible interpretations. One, we saw already that they would carry the body to the cemetery. And as they were carrying it, they would stop every once in a while, do a hesped, do a eulogy, and then continue. And then stop and do a eulogy. So maybe they were in the middle of this procession. Or it could be that during the Shiva, people would eulogize them, and that's called eulogies also, even though we don't necessarily call that a eulogy, but it's enough to be considered a eulogy. So either one or the other, but they said, he said, they're still dealing with eulogies, so yes. So now they say, Savor l'mikre la'alter. Okay, so now they react, and when they say, okay, we're going to tear kriya right now. To which Abaye says, no, you still got it wrong. Amar lu Abaye, Tanya chacham kvodo behespedo. Right now, they're not doing a hesped. So next time somebody gets up and does a hesped, that's when you should tear kriya. In other words, when it's a chacham, you should specifically tear kriya while they're eulogizing the chacham. So basically, Abaye corrects them over and over again until they eventually get it right. Now we're going to see a lot of different things that happen where Rav Huna dies. Okay, Rav Huna was a student of Rav, living in Bavel, time of the second generation of Moraim, very big scholar, which we're going to see right now. Kinach nafshei de Rav Huna. They wanted to put a Sefer Torah on the bier where he was, right? His body was there. They wanted to put a Sefer Torah on it out of respect because he was such a big Talmid Chacham. Well, what happens? Amar lu Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda, now we're going to see a whole bunch of reactions of Rav Chisda, which is going to be interesting because the next story is going to be when Rav Chisda dies. So keep this in mind. Rav Chisda says, something he didn't believe in during his lifetime, you're now going to do to him in his death. What is that? Amar Rav Tachlifa had said, Ana chazite le Rav Huna, debai lemeitav apulia. I saw Rav Chisda wanted to sit down on a bed, which again is kind of like a bench. V'hava manach sefer Torah alei, and there was a sefer Torah on it. V'kaf kada a'ara, he put a jug on, I assume a big jug, on the ground. V'otiv sefer Torah lave, he took the sefer Torah off, right? We know this halacha that you don't sit on a bench or somewhere where there's a sefer Torah on it. So this is where it comes from. And he wouldn't sit on it, right? He made sure to move the Torah before he sat down on the bench. So now that he died, you're right, and people now sidurim, chumashim, any Sifrei Kodesh. So now that he's dead, you're going to put a Sefer Torah where he's lying? It seems totally inappropriate. So, and it's, specifically, he was the one who said it, right? Alma kasavar, from there you can infer from the story that Rav Tachlifa said that you can't sit on a bench where there's a Sefer Torah. So also when he's lying on his bier, you can't just put a Sefer Torah on it. Not appropriate. So they didn't do that. Now, that was number one. Story number two. Lo have a nafik puri amibav. Now you ever have this situation when you're moving and they can't fit the couch through the door, right? The doorway's too narrow. It happens in Israel a lot, right? And abroad, maybe less so. There's sometimes bigger entries, but certainly here this happens a lot. You can't get things through the door. So now they put them in a coffin and they can't get the coffin out the door. It's too wide for the door. So now they're stuck. How are they going to get it out? They thought, okay, let's take it outside the roof, right? That they could get it up to the roof and then they can do it over the house. And that's the best way to get it out. But Amar lu Rav Chisda, again, Rav Chisda comes and says, no, We learned chacham kvodo derech petach. No, it's respectful to take him out through the front doors. Can't do that. So what's the next thing they thought? Savor lan shuya mipuria lapuria. Says, okay, let's move him to a different coffin. Amalu Rav Chisda, I see you're asking how they get it in. I assume they built it in the house, right? This happens, right? You bring your furniture in, you build your furniture in your house, and then you go to move, you have to take your furniture apart because otherwise it won't go through the door. So they must have built it in the room, not paying attention to the size. Anyway, they said, let's switch him to a different one. Amalu Rav Chisda, no can do. We learned chacham kvodo b'mitah rishona. When you put him in the first coffin, that's where he stays. You can't start moving him. How do we know this? They compare, and you're going to see this comparison. Maybe the fact they wanted to put a Sefer Torah there, they're going to compare him to the Aron Kodesh. Okay, so now we're going to see the Aron Habrit that existed in the time of David HaMelech. How do we know that this is the case, that you can't move him to a different coffin? When they carry the Aron Elohim, they left it in. Now it's a little bit weird. It says new. It doesn't mean new. It means original. In the original Agalah, there's a big debate about what was the original Agalah that they left it in. Was it the one, the Plishtim? If you remember, the Plishtim ended up with the Aron, right? And then they returned it with all these oxen along with it. So some people say it was that one. The problem with that is that if you remember, what they did was they made a mizbach and they took the Agalah that the Plishtim had sent it with, and they offered up the parot, and they did it with the actual Agalah. So how could that possibly be? Some people say, no, they only took off a few boards and they left the base of it, and that's what they used to carry the Aron. Some people say it wasn't the one that the Plishtim sent, it was when the Plishtim sent it back and we used that, then they put it in a new Agalah at that point, and that was the one that they made sure to use further down the road. Either which way, it was right? You can't change, just like can't move the Aron into some other wagon, you also can't move the rabbi, the chacham, into a different bed. So can't do it through the roof, can't switch. So what are you going to do? The only thing left is pros baba ba'afkua. So they opened up the door frame. They basically knocked down the door frame, widened it, and with that, they were able to get the body out. Next part of the story. Patachale Rabbi Abba. So Rabbi Abba starts to say, eulogize him. What does he say? And it's a good question whether this is a compliment or not. You can interpret it how you like. He should have been a prophet, okay? The Ruach HaKodesh should have been on him, but what happened? He lived in Babylonia, okay? If he had lived in Eretz Israel, he would have had Ruach HaKodesh. So in a sense, it's almost insulting him that he didn't go to make Aliyah. On the other hand, it's saying he was of a very high madrega, as we say, right, at a very high level that he had the potential to have Ruach HaKodesh. So now they say, right, he could have been a prophet. So Mati Rav Nachman bar Chisda, Rav Hanan bar Chisda, one of Rav Chisda's sons, says to him, how could you possibly say that you can't get nevuah outside of Israel? Hayo haya, he quotes a pasuk from Yechezkel. Hayo haya, the Devar Hashem al Yechezkel ben Buzia Kohen be'eretz Kasdim. The word of God was with Yechezkel in Babylonia. So what are you talking about? Tafach le'avua b'sandale, he hits him with his sandal, and he says, you silly son, what are you talking about? Amar le, lava minachach lo titrod alma. Haven't I told you stop bothering me with your silly questions? My haya, shekfal haya. Hayo haya means it already was. Okay, meaning he started off in Israel and got Ruach HaKodesh in Israel. So then when he went to Babylonia, we're talking about Yechezkel, he already had Ruach HaKodesh, because of that he was able to keep it. But if you start in Babylonia, there's no hope of you having Ruach HaKodesh. Okay, next part of the story. Now they go to bring Rav Huna's body to Israel. Okay, you see that they did it in those days as well, where they bring bodies all the time now to Israel. They brought his body to Israel. Funny kind of story. Amrulei the Rabbi Ami ul Rabbi Asi, who both started off their lives in Babylonia, and we'll see in a minute that they were kind of under Rav Huna in Babylonia, and they were scared to death of him. And then they moved to Israel, and they become the heads of Israel. Okay, Rav Huna is not there anymore, so they become the heads of Israel. So they tell Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, Rav Huna ate. Rav Huna is coming. Now notice they didn't say the body of Rav Huna is coming. They said Rav Huna is coming. So they didn't know that Rav Huna had died. So they think that Rav Huna is actually coming while he's alive. So Amle, listen, when we were there, we couldn't even pick our heads up to him. In other words, we were scared of him. Now that we're here and we've set ourselves up as the manigim here, now he's coming here, like what's going to be with us, and how are we going to relate to this? Because we're in charge here, but there we were subservient to him. So how are we going to deal with this? They said to them, Aronoba. No, he's coming not alive. He's coming dead. Okay, we're bringing his coffin. Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Asi Nefuk. So now they went to follow the coffin out of respect for him. Rabbi Elav, Rabbi Chanina lo nafik. But these two rabbis did not go after the coffin. Some people say that the part about going after the coffin had nothing to do with Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Asi, and there was a split between Rabbi Ela nafik and Rabbi Chanina lo nafik, between the two of them. Okay, either way, there was the split. Some people followed the coffin and some people didn't. The question is why? Gemara is going to answer. Denafik my time are the ones who went out after the coffin. Why is that? Tanya. It says in a Braita, Aron ha'over mimakom lemakom. Okay, if you bring an Aron from far away, okay, and basically the issue is that a lot of time has passed since you died. This isn't like today where this will be within a number of hours, a day, something like that. We're talking about many, many days of travel. It's already been a long time after the death. Still, omdim alav b'shura v'omrim alav berkat avelim v'tanchumei avelim. Right, you do the shura where they console the mourners. They say this berkat avelim, which they normally said the sudat of ra'ah, and they do tanchumei avelim. Okay, we treat it the same. So that's why they said, okay, we're going to walk after the coffin. Delo nafik my time. So what about the ones who didn't follow the coffin? Ditanyas, it says in a Braita, and now we're going to see an absolutely contradictory Braita. We're going to have to resolve this because this Braita says the exact opposite of the previous. All the things we just said in the previous Braita, it says in this Braita, we don't. So it sounds like they're saying those follow that one and those follow that one, but the Gemara says, no, that's not it. Kashina adade. Right? They can't imagine, the Gemara always likes to resolve contradictions between Braithot if they can't imagine that these two opinions exist saying total opposite things. So how do we resolve the contradiction? And with that, we'll understand why we had this split between the rabbis. The question is the skeleton of the body still in place? Right? What happens over time is the bones that are connected to each other start falling apart and you just have random bones. So if the bones are no longer intact, then you don't do any of those things. If they're still intact, meaning still connected to each other, then you do. So the Gemara says, so again, why was there a split? Either it was or it wasn't. So what happened here? Rav Huna shildo kayemet hava. He was still intact, the skeleton. Delo nafik lo samu kameh, but the ones who didn't follow didn't get all the details of the story. And they thought that the bones were no longer connected to each other, the skeleton wasn't intact, and therefore they didn't follow the coffin. They were basically wrong. By the way, you see a lot of things here where the rabbis were wrong in what they thought, right? How to get it out the door. They were wrong in thinking they shouldn't tear kriya for Rav Safra, right? I don't know why they're saying this, but it's almost interesting because it's all the sugya about these great rabbis, and then you're seeing about all these other rabbis that made a lot of mistakes. Maybe it's just showing that rabbis are, also make mistakes. Okay, next story with Rav Huna. We're still not done with him. Okay, this is maybe the most interesting. Amrei hechi nanche. Where are we going to bury him now? Okay, comes the question. Okay, where's his burial plot? Right, he didn't buy a plot in Eretz Chaim or something. So, where are we supposed to bury him? Rav Huna rebates to Rabbi Yisrael. The Rabbi Chia rebates to Rabbi Yisrael, right? As we call Gzera Shava. They make a comparison between him and Rabbi Chia. Right? He was great. He spread Torah to many, many people. He was a teacher for many. Also, Rabbi Chia was, the last one we could think of that was of that stature. So we're going to put him next to Rabbi Chia. What's the issue? Well, you have to go into the burial cave where Rabbi Chia is buried. People were a little nervous to do that, right? Man ma'ayale. So who's going to, they said, who's going to go in to the kever? Now you'll see it by the end of the story why they were a little nervous, because actually something happens there. Amar lehu Rav Chaga. Rav Chaga comes forward and says, Ana ma'ayalin ale. I will. Now, Rav Chaga, you know from his name, because his name is Rav and not Rebbe. Okay, we've talked about this before, although I'll repeat it because I haven't talked about it in a long time. The Rebbe are people always from Israel. Rav is someone that wasn't in Israel. Okay, presumably he was in Babylonia, because they already, at a certain point, they determined you can't get smicha outside of Israel. So he obviously lived in Babylonia. Now he's living in Israel, because otherwise, why would he be there? But he obviously got a smicha in Bavel, and that's why he was called Rav. And you're going to see from the story, He said, I will do it. I was his student when I was 18. Some people say it's because Lochazili carry, like I was his prize student because I never had a seminal emission. And I would learn with him, and I knew I was always with him, and I saw this thing that had happened to him. By the way, I believe that some people even think he's talking about Rabbi Chia. It's unclear whether he's talking about Rabbi Chia or Rav Huna, but presumably he's talking about Rav Huna. He says one day his ritzuah, we call it I can't think of the word, the straps of the tefillin flipped, right? It has to be always facing one way, and it flipped the wrong way. And he sat 40 fasts for this. So, right. So thank you. Yeah, the Shansin does say Rabbi Chia, but other Parshaniyot say it was Rav Huna, which makes sense that Rav Chaga is talking specifically about Rav Huna, because I was a student when I was young, when I was in Bevel. Anyway, there's a debate about what it is. You're going to see there's a debate about a lot of these stories today about which rabbi it's referring to. This is always a problem when they don't say the name and they just refer back to him, and there were two hymns just before. It's not so clear. I prefer the Rav Huna because that's what makes Rav Chaga stand out from everybody else, because he grew up in Babylonia, so he had what to do with Rav Huna when he was young, and therefore it was appropriate for him. Again, if you go with the Rav Huna, it means I'm not scared of Rav Huna. I had what to do with him when I was younger, and because of that. Okay, so now Aile. So he brings in the coffin of Rav Huna into the grave. Now he goes into this burial cave and he sees, right, he's surrounded by his two sons. Yehuda's on his right, which obviously means he was the more prominent. Chizkiah is on his left. Okay. So far, that sounds kind of normal that you would see this, but the next part is not exactly so normal. Okay, he starts to see a conversation go on between the two dead brothers. So Yehuda says to Chizkiah, Kum midachtech, come out from your spot. Get up to love or dekaim Rav Huna behind dekaim Rav Huna. Says it's not appropriate that Rav Huna is standing there and you're lying in your grave. Get up and make room for him, right? The older brother probably says to the younger brother, you get up. Okay. So again, he was the one on the left, so you have to assume he had the less prominent position. So Bahade dekaim, Chizkiah starts to get up, and what happens? Kam Bahade amuda denur, a big shot of fire comes out of the grave. Okay, meaning this wasn't really the best idea, I guess, is what they're saying. And Chazia Rav Chaga, he sees this fire. He gets super scared. And what does he do as a result? Zakfe la'aroneh, he stands up the aron, almost maybe to protect him. And nafik ata, and he goes out. Okay, now, nafik ata, there's two ways to, nafik means to go out, and ata usually means to come in. So some people read it as he went out. He was scared, and then he came back later, and he buried him k'moshe tzarich, the way he should have. Some people think, no, he left, and the kever, the coffin of Rav Huna is standing to this day. Okay, and he never properly put him down because he was freaked out by the fire coming out and didn't want to die. Now, why was he protected from the fire? Why didn't the fire get to him? Mishum dezakfe la'aroneh de Rav Huna, because he stood up the aron of Rav Huna almost like it acted as a shield, and the zchuyot of Rav Huna protected him. In other words, what they're kind of saying is that you're not really supposed to move the bones of somebody. Now, it's true, Rav Huna was a big gadol, and that's why he was protected, because he had a good reason to do it, but he really shouldn't have been starting up here, and it was a mistake to have done it in the first place, and that's why the fire came out and stopped him from doing it. Anyway, very interesting story. We're going to leave it at that. I'm sure there's a lot more you can think about this story. Okay, now we're finished with all the different stories of Rav Huna. We heard a lot of different aspects of things. Now we're going to move on to Rav Chisda. When Rav Chisda died, now remember, he was the one who reacted to all the original things about Rav Huna. And in the beginning, they wanted to put the Sefer Torah on the bed. I see, by the way, Erica, you're asking a question that they do move bones, but I think when they move the bones, they put them in a temporary place for a certain amount of time, and then they move them after. Here, they were already in their final resting place, and I think that would be more of an issue. Although, and in general, it's not looked upon fondly to move bones, okay? There's reasons if you want to move it to Israel, we'll let you do it, but it's not necessarily so, it's kind of frowned upon in general. Again, there are situations where it's okay. So when Rav Chisda died, interestingly, several Tube Sefer Torah Puria, they also wanted to put a Sefer Torah on his bed, to which the rabbi said, Marla Rabbi Yitzchak, Milton to the Rabbelo Sphere, what do you mean? He himself didn't think you should do it for Rav Huna. Now you're going to Anam Nekom B'Ne'avile, we're going to do it for him. Sever de lo Mishlal Krayu, they thought that maybe once they tore kriya, they shouldn't fix the tear. Remember, we learned about there's lishlo, which is to just stitch it up kind of randomly, and then there's to really fix it properly. So they thought we couldn't even stitch it up in a messy kind of way. As soon as you turn your face away, right, you turn around, then already you can fix it up. Now we're going to have a story. Two rabbis died, and they were bringing their bodies to Israel together. So Rabba, the son of Huna, and Rav Huna. Askuni lahata. By the way, there's a bit of a debate about whether this is, I think I saw that there were two Hunas. One was the Reish Galuta and one wasn't, and whether we're talking about the son of the Rav Huna that we just had or maybe a different one. Anyway, this is Rabba Bar Huna and Rav Huna. Askuni lahata. So they bring them up to Israel, turning out on Moed. Kimatu Agishra, when they get to they got to a bridge. Now they were walking side by side. They were going on camels. Kamu Gamle, they get to this narrow bridge and the camels stop because they don't know who's supposed to go first. Amar Lua Utaya. So an Arab merchant comes by, sees that there's these two camels blocking the way. He says, hi, what's going on here? Amrule, they said to him, Rabbanan de Ka'avde Yakara Ahadade. We have a case where each of these rabbis is trying to respect the other. Mar Amar, Mar Neo Beresha, right? Well, Rabba Bar Huna is saying, oh, you Rav Huna, you go first. We all know this kind of situation. Mar Neo Beresha, right? And they're in an impasse. Basically, everyone's saying, oh, you go first, you go first, you go first, you go first. They're stuck. So Amar, the Arab merchant, says, well, I got to get over, I got to get my wares to the other side. I got to get through. So he says, Denahu de Rabba Bar Huna Leo Beresha. Rabba Bar Huna should go first. Why? Because he's Rabba, the son of Huna. And Rav Huna is not known for his father's name. So, right, in respect for his father, he must be a greater Talmid Chacham. Right, interesting that the Arab merchant is the one deciding this, and he should go first. So, Chalif Gamle de Rabba Bar Huna, so he goes first, his camel, and Nator Kache V'Shine Dahutaya, that merchant gets punished and his teeth all fall out, okay, because he basically didn't show respect for Rav Huna's father or for Rav Huna or however you read it, right? Different interpretations as to what exactly he did wrong, but it seems that he wasn't showing proper respect and therefore he got punished. I don't know what the expectation was otherwise because they weren't moving and, he at least got them moving, but seems that he should have been more careful about what he said. Now again, we get to a part where we're not really clear. Are they talking about Rav Huna? Are they talking about Rabba Bar Huna? Are they talking maybe even about both of them? You'll see part of this is a reference to both, although part of it seems to be a reference to only one. So different interpretation. Rashi here, the printed Rashi here, which isn't really Rashi that we talked about, but it brings both interpretations as two possibilities. Anyway, a child starts talking about them, eulogizing them. Geza Yeshishim Allah. Okay, the student of, one who came from great people is now going up. Alami Bavel is coming up from Babylonia to Israel. V'imo Sefer Milchamot, the book of fighting, which could be the Torah, because people fight in a positive way over words of Torah. It could be a reference to this fight between him and the rabbi who's going first. Ke'et v'kipod huchpalu, the curses have been doubled. Lirot b'shod v'shever haba mishinal. Now here's a reference to both of them. In other words, it's a double curse that both these great Talmidei Chachamim have died now. The right Shinar is Bavel, is Babylonia. Katsaf al olamo, God must have gotten angry at his people. The Hamas mimenu nefashot, and the rabbis died as a punishment for the people. But there's this double, right? On the one hand, it's very sad for the people, but for God is like bringing in a new bride because they're going up to Shamayim, to the heavens. Rochev aravot, right, which is a reference to God. Sas v'samech bevo elav nefesh naki v'tzadik. God is thrilled that a pure, clean, righteous nefesh, a soul is going up to God. So there's that, struggle on the one hand, saying it's a great loss for the people, but for that rabbi, it's a huge, or for God, it's respect. Okay, next story. Kinach nafshe de Ravina, patach alehu saftana. So we're just getting different eulogies, and you see, by the way, we've talked about this before. There was a job called the Eulogizer, and that person they were very good at poetry, and they would make these beautiful poems. So we're going to see poem after poem of eulogies for these rabbis. Tmarim hiniu rosh al tzadik ketamar. The dates should kind of bow their head for this righteous one that's coming, who is like a tamar. We know that from his Mor Sheli Yom HaShabbat, it says tzadik katamar yifrach, right? It will blossom like a date. Nasim leilot kiyamim al mesim leilot kiyamim. By the way, there's a typo I saw in the Koran. It says nasim, and then it translates it as women. It's not women. It's nasim, to place. Okay, we will place our nights like days, meaning we will cry all night about the loss. Al mesim leilot kiyamim, for someone who turned his nights into days, meaning he learned all night long. So we will do this. We will cry all night for him. Amar le Rav Ashi le Bar Kipuk. Okay, now again, we're going to have two different interpretations here. Rav Ashi said the Steinsaltz is the Koran. It's the same thing. That's why you said it's in the Steinsaltz in the Koran. That's all the mistake. Okay. Now, it's not clear whether this story relates to the same thing. Rav Ashi now is going to go to Bar Kipuk and to Bar Avin. They were both eulogizers, and he's going to say to them the following. Hahu Yoma, okay, so Amalei Rav Ashi le Bar Kipuk, Hahu Yoma mai amad. On that day, what will you say? Now, what day is he referring to? Some people say, right, Ravina and Rav Ashi often go together. They were from the same time period. Some people say he went to them before they eulogized Ravina and said, what are you going to say about Ravina? Other people say that he went to them and he said, what are you going to say about me when I die? Right? This is it. And maybe it's a reaction to the Ravina, right? He saw Ravina died and he saw the things they said about him. And then he starts saying, well, what are you going to say about me when I die? It's a little bit strange that he would ask them that question. So anyway, it's a bit of a good question as to what exactly, who he's talking about. So either he's saying, how will you eulogize me? Or how are you planning to eulogize Ravina? So Amrle, Bar Kipuk says to him, Amina, I'm going to say, Im ba'arazim nafla shal hevet. If a fire came and burned the cedar, which is always like the greatest trees, meaning if this great gadol died and got burned, Maya asu ezuvekir. What are the ones of the hyssops growing on the walls going to do? In other words, if this is what happens to the gadolim, right, the great people, what's going to happen to everybody else? Livyatan b'chakaho Allah, and he's going to give three images, right? This is why they're poetic, right? Livyatan, if the Leviathan gets hooked by, right, you can hook him up and catch him. Mayasu dagerakak. What about the teeny fish? Right, if he got caught, what about the teeny fish that are in the puddles? Benachal shotef naflachaka. If a hook can hook you in a big stream, mayasu megavim. How are the ones who are in the wells, the fish in the wells, going to be protected? Amarle bar Avin. Now you could see the competition between the eulogizers. He says to him, Chas v'shalom, dechakav v'shal hevet b'tzadikei amina. You can't start using words like he got hooked and he got burned by a fire. First of all, burned by a fire sounds like Gehenom. It sounds like hell. Like, how can you use words like that when you're talking about a tzaddik? Very inappropriate words. So, Umay Amart. So he says to him, okay, Bar Avin, what would you say? Right? Big mouth. So, what about you? Amina, he says, I would say, Bachula avelim velola aveda. Cry for the mourners. This is similar to what we saw before, that it's sad for the people living, but for them, their neshama is going up to heaven. God is ready to greet his kala. So here also, cry for the avelim, but not for the person who was lost, right? The aveda is an item that was lost, not for him. Shehila minucha, because his soul is going to peace. The anu la'anacha, it's us who are at a loss. We're crying. Chalash date alayu v'itapuch ka'ayu. Okay, they both got punished. He, right, the first one for using these words of fire and hook, and the second one for calling him a lost, an aveda, a lost item. That's an inappropriate way. He wasn't so careful with his words either. And what happened? Their feet turned around. Okay, their feet kind of went in the reverse direction. And then they couldn't come eulogize him on that day. Now, again, either it means that exact day, because it was Ravina had died and they were talking about Ravina, or in the future when Rav Ashi did, right, they couldn't come forward. Okay, Rav Ashi was known to have said about both these people, they can't do chalitza, which is that the ceremony where you take off the shoe because their feet have to be right in order to do the ceremony of chalitza. So this is a reference. They're saying when you heard Rav Ashi say that, it had to do with this story because their feet had turned around. Okay. Now we're we're a little bit off on a tangent, not talking about death, maybe a near-death situation. But we mentioned Bar Avin, who was the eulogizer. We're going to see that he wasn't just the eulogizer. He was also one of the people who prayed. If you remember from Tani, we have all these people that were known to be Baalei Tefillah, that they would pray for people. So Rava, one day, Ki Ava Ata L'Diglat, he gets to the Tigris River, and he's worried about being caught up, swept up in the river. Amar Leila Bar Avin, Kum Ema Milti, he says to Bar Avin, go say something about me, help me, go pray for me. So Kaiva Amari gets up and he says, Ba'u Rov Shlishit B'mayim, the majority of the third went into the water. Now, the third is a reference to the Jewish people. There's a pasuk that talks about them as the third. So he's saying you're like the majority of the Jewish people. Okay, your greatness is like the majority. So the majority of the Jewish people is in the water. Zichor v'rachem, God have pity on him. Ta'inu me'acholecha ki isha mi'ba'ala. We've left your ways like a woman who leaves her husband, right, who cheats on him. Al taznichenu ka'ot me'marad. Don't leave us like when the woman drinks the bitter waters. We'll get to that in Masechet Sota. The Sota waters, right? Don't leave us behind like that. So he prayed for him. So that was just an aside about Bar Avin and how he was a person who prayed for other people. Now we're going to go. We have this list here in parentheses. I'm not going to read them all, but all these rabbis that we're going to see things about their eulogies. Rabbi Chanin Chatnei de Ben Nasi. He was the son-in-law of the Ben Nasi. Lo kavahavale bane. He didn't have sons. Ba rachamei v'havale. So he prayed to God. He ended up getting a son. Hahu Yom Dehavale, the day the son was born. Nach nafshe, terribly tragic story. He dies. Patach aleu safdana. So here we're going to see what the eulogizer said. Remember, his name is Chanin. Okay. Simcha letugane efcha, right? The happiness turned to tragedy. Sason v'yagon nidbaku, happiness and sorrow, right? Stuck together, meaning right, you have this very happy day. On the other hand, you have this very sad day. Be'et simchaton enach. Right, in the time of his happiness, he sighed, meaning he died. Be'et chaninato avad chanino. In the time these prayers were answered, right, the child's chanina, the child's salvation, kind of his savior, was gone. Asiku lechanan al shmei, and they called him Hanan by the name, right? They called him Hanan because his father was Chanin. So you see here the way he spoke. Be'et chaninato avad chanino is a reference to Rav Chanin. Kinach nafshe de Rabbi Yochanan, patach alei Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar, kasheh hayom liYisrael kiyom bo hashemesh b'tzoraim. So this is how they eulogized him. Today is a sad day. It's like a day that the sun sets in the middle of the day. Tichtiv, as it says in the following pasuk, v'haya b'yom hahu v'heveti hashemesh b'tzoraim. On that day, I will bring, like the sun will set in the afternoon. V'amar Rabbi Yochanan himself said, Zeh yomo shel Yoshiyahu. This is when Yoshiyahu died. He was only 39 when he was killed. We saw his story not so long ago. Not going to repeat the whole story, but he gets shot by Paro Necho, who's trying to pass through the land. He doesn't let him pass through. Anyway, Rabbi Yochanan said that was right. He died young, and here we're sad that Rabbi Yochanan died, but he did. Kinach nafshei de Rabbi Yochanan. Another thing that happens when he dies, not a eulogy, but something else. Yativ Rabbi Ami Shiva Shloshim. Rabbi Ami sat Shiva and Shloshim. Am Rabbi Abba berei Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Rabbi Ami da'avid legarmehu da'avid. So Rabbi Abba says, he did this on his own. This wasn't halacha. You don't have to do this. Dahachi amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba amar Rabbi Yochanan. Even Rabbi Yochanan himself said, "Afilu rabo shelimdo chochma ino yoshev ela yom echad." You only sit shiva for one day. You don't sit a full shiva. Kinach nafshei de Rabbi Zera patach aleahu safdana. Okay, last hesped for today. So we started eulogizing Rabbi Zera. If you remember, Rabbi Zera moved from Babylonia and then he moves to Israel. He gets mich in Israel. That's why it's called Rabbi Zera. So Eretz Shin'ar Harabi Yalda, like the land of Shin'ar, which is Bavel, gave birth to him. Eretz Tzvi Gidla Shashuaha. And Eretz Tzvi, which is Israel, brought up its prized, its beloved son. Oin Allah Amra Rakat Ki Yibdak Lechem Data. So Rakat, which is a reference to Tiberia, if you remember, we learned that also. So Tiberia is sad because it lost its beautiful, its biggest treasure. Now we're going to end with a list of 12 rabbis who die and something weird goes on in nature or somewhere, right? In nature, outside, in a way of showing something is off, okay? There's something wrong. You can try to darshan them, why exactly and what, but anyway, we'll go through them. The pillars of Caesarea ran with water, okay? As if like all the tears of crying over him. To Rabbi Yossi, Shaf Umer Zevedet Tzipora Dama, the gutters in Tzipori started spilling out blood. Okay, why blood? So some people say, right, it's just a reference to tears. Some people say blood. The Tosfot gives a few reasons. One of them is that he was moser nefesh on what it was. I mean, he gave his I can't think of the words, how you say Moser Nefesh, if someone can help me. But anyway, he was very strict, I guess, about Brit Milah. And because of that, it was blood. He dedicated himself. Yeah, I know, better word, but right. Like he was willing to give his life up for this mitzvah. I guess that's the best way to say it. Okay, next. To Rabbi Yaakov. The stars came out during the day. Again, you have something odd happening that makes people realize something's going wrong here. To Rabbi Asi, Aku Koli Lanaya. All the trees got uprooted. Maybe like a huge storm came and knocked down all the trees. To Rabbi Chia, Nechitu Kipe Denura Mirakia. Stones of fire started falling from the heavens. To Rabbi Menachem, it's not Rabbi Yossi, it should be a different Rabbi Menachem. But anyway, Ishtu'ut Samanaya Vahavu Lemechlatzaya. All the images on the coins became flat, okay, no longer images. Some will say it's because he was so careful not to do avodah zarah in any way, shape, or form. He never looked at the coins, at the shapes on the coins, and therefore they became flat. To Rabbi Tanchum bar Achia, something very similar. It kitzuzu called andarta. All the andartaot, the statues, kind of fell, okay, got knocked down. Like there were all these statues all around of kings and things like that. All the monuments basically fell. Again, an idea of this avodah zarah, that he was so careful about it, and because of that, they fell. To Rabbi El Yashiv, they dug 70 tunnels of thieves. Okay, the thieves kind of come up through the tunnels. And why is that? Because when he was alive, he protected them from thieves. And as soon as he died, well, no longer, so they were able to do it. To Rav Huna, hail comes down from the heavens. To Rabba Rav Yosef, Neshuk Kipe de Prat Ahadade. There's a reference, Rabba and Rav Yosef were together, and now the bridge that went over the Euphrates fell apart and like kind of touched, the sides touched, but fell apart. Tabai Virava, the same thing happened, but instead of in the Prat, it was on the Chidekel, Neshuk Kipe de Diglat Ahadade, the Tigris River. The bridge is over the Tigris. And the last one, Kinach Nafshe de Rav Misharshia, Taun Dikle Shitze. The thorns started growing out of the palm trees. Okay, so again, all these unnatural phenomenon to show what a great loss it was. Either he can no longer protect us from certain things, or just things are different, right? And as a sign to everyone to realize how terrible a day it is that this person has died. Okay, with all that sadness for today, we will pick up with our daf for tomorrow. Have a Shavua Tov, everyone.